So we're here to talk not only about your research and your most recent books and about Soviet history in general, but about you and your career, partly because it throws quite a lot of light on the later Cold War. And of course, it throws light on the present too, partly because people doing research right now in the archives in Moscow found things a little harder after the war in Ukraine. That can be a sideline. But I want to start with your first trips to the USSR in the late 60s. You were doing your dissertation in Oxford at St Antony's, and you got yourself onto a British Council exchange programme so you could spend time in Moscow. What was it like? How did that happen? What was going on in the time when you got there?
Well, it was for me a great adventure and a great feeling of triumph when I finally got on the boat to Leningrad. I think it was the Baltica. A week later than the other British Council people. There'd been this problem that I was Australian and not British and so on. So finally I get there. And it is hard now to think back into that time when there really was a feeling you were crossing something like an iron curtain. You were in another world about which very little was known and which was seen to be a dangerous world. There was always a question of you were always aware, you may need to call on the protection of your embassy or whatever. The good thing about being on the British or any of the exchanges, the key thing to my mind looking back was that you couldn't be arrested once you were on those exchanges. That was the sort of agreement, the unspoken agreement. You could be sent home. You could have your future research completely jeopardized, but you were safe
from the Lubyanka.
safe from the ultimate. And when the exchanges ceased to exist with the collapse of the Soviet Union, I don't think we quite immediately realized what we'd lost.
How lucky you were.
Yeah, that particular kind of security. And as a matter of fact, I mean, when I look back on it, all those years, I went first in 1966. And I went back regularly after that to work in archives. And sometimes the regime was worse and sometimes it was better. And but the exchanges were never interrupted, not for 1968, not. And of course now that kind of academic traffic is interrupted.
Mm.
Although I'm not sure that I agree with you about the question of access to archives now, judge on what I've heard, but we can come back to that.
We should, yeah.
So I arrived there. I'd asked to go to Leningrad. So, of course, they sent me to Moscow. And that was good because Moscow was where more materials were. And anyway, I've found Leningrad is an absolutely beautiful city, but Moscow is a fascinating one, full of contradictions, and I like contradictions. And so I had my Oxford topic at that point was working on a sort of intellectual political biography of Anatoly Lunacharsky, who was the first Commissar of Enlightenment or Education. And I wanted, therefore, to be able to work on his personal papers, which were in the Central Party archive. So they said absolutely no to that. I didn't fully realize that they didn't let people work in archives on the Soviet period. I felt I was entitled to work on archives in the Soviet period, but there was no basis actually for this belief. But then I thought, okay, it's the state archives seemed a more possible target, although they also didn't let anybody in, any foreigners in. So I asked, and I kept bugging them, and in the end they gave in, and they let me work on his ministry. In effect, it was called a commissariat. It was called an archival, but on his ministry.
So these were not the personal papers; these were the official ones, and that was the difference.
So he appears only in his ministry, insofar as he's chairing the meetings of the collegium, the sort of dominant senior body within it. So at first I was disappointed because, and in fact, it's all about education. And what did I care about education? I was interested in high culture and intelligentsia and so on. But then, quite soon, I realized what a treasure trove I'd got because I had really quite good records of of a government ministry. It actually didn't really matter which one it was. And I could see how it interacted with party bodies, with other government ministries, with the regions. This was the time of the heyday of totalitarian model, which held, implausible though it might be, that everything came from above and there was nothing coming from below, and there was also no institutional politics. There were no bureaucratic conflicts because when Politburo said that's what happened. Well, that is not what my archive showed me. Absolutely not. So I was really fascinated by that. I had to learn very quickly because I had not come prepared to think about bureaucracy and political, forms of government.
Yeah.
That wasn't my field at all. But that's what I saw was new there. I knew nothing about bureaucracy. I really knew nothing. I was very young. I'd had a typical academic career. You go to a university, you do well, they send you on to the next step, and then they send you off to Oxford, and. So bureaucracy was something I had absolutely no sense of until I landed with these archives. I was also very lucky because the interpretation of bureaucratic documents requires quite a lot of skill and knowledge. I was very lucky to find some people who had worked with my man Lunacharsky in the ministry.
And one was Igor Satz, wasn't it?
Igor was his personal. Igor, his brother-in-law, much younger brother-in-law, was really his sort of literary secretary. I don't know that we have such a title, but
if only we did.
If only. Anyway, in other words, the person who doesn't do the not just admin but intellectual stuff. So Igor was still around, and he became a really important person in my life. But initially, he was extremely important for telling me what was going on behind the scenes. Plus, he found some other old staffers. He knew them all, and some of them were around, and they were people who remembered much more the purely bureaucratic things, the less not the politics of it, not the sort of intellectual argument so much, but the actual day-to-day organizational things. So I was very lucky to be able to run my written documents and my oral histories, or whatever you call it, in tandem.
And presumably not just the bureaucracy and the way that one department got on with another, but there must have been some of the factionalism, as it were, was driven by personalities and
oh yes,
the way.
Oh yes,
and
that
so
was all. In other words, it operated like any political system you would expect to operate. But the thing about totalitarian systems was they were meant to be different. Not people when there were supposedly no factions, and there was no bureaucratic politics. There was no wheeling and dealing. No agreements about how to present something to the Politburo so it could go through. But of course, I found all of these things.
Yeah.
And there Igor, of course, remembered a lot of the cunning political maneuvers that they'd done. Yes, so every kind of politics that you could think of was in there. But a bureaucratic archive is best on the bureaucratic politics. In other words, just think about the kind of records that, if you've ever worked in a bureaucracy, what gets left. The personal factions and dislikes, they are there only between the lines.
They're implied, so that must be part of the fun.
Yes, they're implied, but they're very seldom spelled out.
Yeah. So that's, I suppose, one of the things that countered the usual impression. It was a surprise to you. But one thing that I think, you've carried on writing about really is, since you've covered, fantastically and wonderfully usefully for everyone, the entire history of the Soviet Union, beginning with the Bolshevik Revolution, I think along with the business about the assumption about totalitarianism, there's also the point that I think still in some ways hasn't fundamentally sunk in, that the Soviet Union was a union and a union of republics, and that there's still, or maybe it's come back again, this sort of sense that the identification of the Soviet Union with Russia. And of course, there are various nationalisms, etc., involved. But would you like to tell us a little bit about how the nationalisms fitted with
Absolutely.
yeah.
I have to say, I came in, it was hard enough learning the Russia bit and hard enough learning Russian. I was not particularly alert to the national, well, none of us were. There we were just stuck with Moscow, even when we got archives. And it was a later generation, Terry Martin, who was my student at Chicago, who really started. Well, Ron Suni, actually, I should say Ron at that time, but I didn't at this time know Ron, he was working on the Caucasus. However, in my ministry stuff, these were education ministries, and that's a republic level thing. There is not a Soviet education. There was not a Soviet education ministry because that was held to be, to be limiting the prerogatives of the separate Republican ministries. And so, of course, in my, as I look, what are the issues that they're talking about, they included discussions with other Republican ministries, but particularly the Ukraine. The Ukraine was the one, the best functioning one, the most assertive, and there was the language issue, and so I took that in. The Ukrainian Ministry of Education, I noticed. And of course, later on, when I started engaging with actually the substance of education policy more, and realized that what was going on was this kind of affirmative action program, which was at first not entirely clear to me. Affirmative action on behalf both of lower classes, of workers and poor peasants, and of backward, in quotes, nationalities. Now, the backward nationalities were essentially everybody but Russia, Ukraine, Georgia, and Jewish. So all those other nationalities deserve help getting promoted within institutions and especially getting jobs. So that was that was the other aspect of the nationality regime that I came upon. But I focused, as I say, the affirmative action was both on class and nationality basis. And Terry was the one who much later really looked at the nationality one. I worked out there doing it. It was, to me at that point, it seemed less conceptually problematic, because the class one, there was the question, you say you're promoting the working class, but what is the working class? Is the working class, are those people who were workers before the revolution? And if so, does it matter if they were born in the village and went back to the village during the Civil War? In other words, how are you estimating, how are you finding out who deserves your help via affirmative action in a class sense? Now, of course, there are all kinds of problems about identification by nationality too, but I didn't know about that then.
I suppose we've been talking about the bureaucratic, it's still high politics we're talking about. But a lot of your work really was, lower down, has been lower down the scale. And how, I'm fundamentally interested in the archive stuff and the things you did have access to, the things you couldn't get. And how was it possible to do that sort of sociological part of things?
It was really
with great
difficult.
difficulty. Yeah.
It was really difficult because you don't have the ministry for lower classes or whatever. And they, of course, did an enormous amount of attempting to do a sort of class analysis in the 1920s. This is a class analysis of the population and see who was a kulak and how many kulaks, how many middle peasants, how many poor peasants, and so on. And that is the most remarkable statistical artifact, which, however, has the problem that these are imposed categories whose relationship to reality is quite slight. Because, ironically, a Marxist class analysis was almost the worst one to apply to a post-revolutionary society, because what happens, first of all, a revolution following a major war, there's been an upheaval. Everybody's not where they were. The children are not going to be what the parents were. And on top of that, you have a regime that wants to dispossess the old elites and to promote non-elites into elites. And therefore, everybody's in
So
movement.
it isn't
And
well
so,
turned upside down.
So that now you can say, okay, there was a working class in situ, however closely connected with the peasantry, but which could be got at via the trade unions, in principle. However, my topic was not trade unions. The Soviets were very insistent that you got material only for your topic. So when I was working on Lunacharsky. So if I wanted some meetings of the collegium that he didn't participate in, or a subcommittee that he didn't help, no, that's not Lunacharsky, right? So couldn't have that. So similarly, of course, trade unions, except the educational trade union, if Lunacharsky had some contact with it, which he didn't usually, but I'd still got a little bit of education trade union. But I think it was probably more in rare publications in the Lenin Library than archival. Anyway, after I'd finished that book, I kept on going back as often as I could. And my next topic was the politics of industrialization. That's the book I wrote part of and never finished. There was a sort of great break in my life when I end of the 70s, I guess. Anyway, there was a very fallow period, and when things stopped, and that was one of the things that stopped, apart from one article. However, politics of industrialization gives you, that's a legitimate. It's legitimate to want to look at trade unions in that context, and so I asked for trade unions. Now, this trade union is the Central Council. That is not grassroots. What I got was fascinating stuff at the end of the 1920s, when Stalin's henchman Lazar Kaganovich was going into the unions and saying, we all have a common interest in the well-being in the state. So just get rid of this antagonistic mindset that you have from capitalism, that workers' rights are to be asserted against management, because management now is Soviet management, and that is a whole different thing. So that was, of course, very interesting. And the trade unionists tended to say, well, yes, but, wages and so on, these are things that need to be negotiated. So that was really interesting, but I made a fundamental mistake as I was working on it. I was so pleased with this material, which nobody had anything like it. Nothing published like it. We were in the foreigners' reading room, and there were other foreigners there, including on this particular day, an American, whom I knew not very well. But so you remember when people used to smoke, that they would go out and smoke anyway. So we would go out and smoke in a little area just outside the archives, and occasionally the woman in charge of us, who sat there, would be out there. But I assumed she didn't know in English, and that was my big mistake, because I said to this American on our smoke break, I can't believe what I've got.
Gave it all away.
And it stopped abruptly.
No access.
No more after. They didn't take it, but they just... You get material like that, and you say, yes, that was very interesting for 1929. Now can I have 1930? And that usually works. But it didn't in this case. we just stopped. So that was I had very little success in with politics of industrialization. I got really good stuff about the bureaucratic politics of it, but not grassroots. And of course, it wasn't a grassroots topic; it was a politics topic. At one point, this is a story I told in Spy in the Archives, I think. At one point, suddenly landed on me something I hadn't asked for. It was about convict labor. But again, this is state policy. This was a ministry assigning convict labor to a project. And I couldn't believe why did they send me this? But, I didn't say anything. I read it carefully. I wrote down everything. I wrote down as many notes as thoroughly as I could. And then I said, as one always did, yes, that was quite interesting for 1934, 35, so 35, 36 now, or whatever. And that went nowhere. But I never understood why I'd got it until come Perestroika. I met the deputy head of the archive socially, as now you could do. And she said, "Did you like the present I sent you 10 years ago or something?" And this was her present. And the present was because I was such a работоспособный. I was a hard worker.
Yeah.
A hard worker.
They were impressed.
And on the level. I mean, in other words, hard worker conveyed to her that I was really a historian and not a spy.
Yeah. And there must have been there must have been a sense that they were not so, other people were not so welcome and were suspected of.
Yeah. Well, all of us were a little bit suspect until we showed otherwise, because, their argument there, which is not wholly wrong, they thought these people are just here to find out our dirty secrets. Well, historians sort of
That's your job.
do want to do that.
Yes.
And of course, if I came across a dirty secret, I was going to go after it. Of course I would. And this would actually have nothing to do with my attitude to the Soviet Union, although they always thought that somehow these two things were connected. Anyway, I got off the subject of grassroots stuff. I didn't even know where would I get any kind of grassroots stuff to do a sort of from below thing. That was not until the mid-'80s when I started to do a book on collectivization. And I became aware, people wrote a lot of letters to newspapers in Soviet times. They had multiple functions, these letters, but to redress injustices and to ask for things and so on. So I became aware that peasants, or sometimes via scribes, but often just literate peasants, wrote to the thing called the peasant newspaper. Now, I also became aware that this was not sitting in the state archives in the place it should be. It had been removed to a cabinet, to an office, which I had no idea of this practice, but the big historians, in this case Viktor Danilov, they would remove large amounts of relevant material to their cabinet, and they just had the conventionally, they then had more or less sole rights to it until they'd finished using it. But Danilov was kind enough to tell me that he had this and that I could have it. I mean, I could use it. And he told the archives, and so they let me use it. And that was my source for the closest I could get to a grassroots. It was peasants writing about things that were annoying them in their collective farm.
And was that across the Soviet Union? The areas covered?
Yes, but it was better for Russia.
Yeah.
Because I think Ukraine also had a peasant newspaper. I don't remember. Yeah. In practice, in practice it was Russian materials, and it, of course, if you think about it, to write about peasants in a non-local way is a kind of crazy thing.
Yeah.
But that's which is what I did in Stalin's Peasants. But my material didn't allow me to do anything more. Since then, of course, people have done the much more sort of intellectually respectable thing of going to a particular area and getting this kind of material. Although I have to say that, the sort of general practices, what I was trying to find out, what I decided I could use this for, was to look at practices. Look at the range of practices in everyday life that peasants will tell the state about. Now, that will be relevant to them in a conversation with the authorities. That means they're never going to write about their sex life. They're not going to write about friendship. They are not going to write about religion unless it is a very specific thing about the use of the church building in there. So you have to assume you're not getting, you're not being invited into their minds, but you are being able to see the kinds of things that habitually go on in the realm outside of sex, religion, and friendship. And those tend to be similar because they're dealing with similar, the institutions are similar. And really, one of the striking things about Soviet everyday life, which I realized as I was doing that Everyday Stalinism book, is that there's lots of stuff coming from below and in the interstices of institutions, but the kind of stuff it is determined by the structures that you're operating within and around. And this is, you can't, even when you're doing that kind of grassroots level stuff, you actually can't forget about state structures because there's such an interaction with them.
Because the bureaucracy extends to local level.
I mean, just the fact that you're in a collective farm. You're not an individual farmer. Individual farmers did sometimes write in, but I didn't particularly focus on it. And that means that your cultivation of the land works in a certain way. You get the tractors in a certain way. All these things, or rather, the official way to do something is always like this, and sometimes there are unofficial ways to do it. But the fact is the tractors are sitting in the machine tractor stations. That's the kind of sort of state reality. The tractors are not sitting in the collective farms at this period that I was looking. They're sitting somewhere else. So that's just, and their drivers are drivers employed by the machine tractor stations. No, they're not your people. So that's just a structure of the kind I'm talking about.